Great to be back. Thank you.
All right, let's get right into this here. I don't know where we want to go first. This article about is the U.S. prepared for war with China, or the announcement that came out from U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo today declaring that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous from China. And this is a decision that many are saying will escalate the U.S.-Chinese relations and have serious economic consequences for both the United States and other nations around the globe. What is your take on this? And let's get the speculation out of the way, first of all. Are we actually close to being in an actual war, if not a second Cold War, this time with China?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by war. Now, when you add that word "cold" in front of it, I think it's clear that we are sliding into that, and you can draw parallels between what just was announced with regard to Hong Kong and Berlin in 1948. So, actually, I wrote something about a year ago now that talked about, I believed that the Chinese Communist Party would move on Hong Kong.
Why is Hong Kong so pivotal? Why do people look at Hong Kong and say that this really is the barometer by which we can measure tension or lack of tension in that region?
Well, so the problem with Hong Kong is it's really the window to the world for China, particularly when it comes to money and Western capital markets, selling stocks, selling bonds. It's really how they get most of their funding. And so when they have decided to essentially write that off, that really means that they are prepared to kind of go their own way. Of course, when they tore up the trade deal, I kind of felt at that point that they were ready to decouple. So we've talked about the U.S. decoupling from China, but in reality, I think what we missed is the Chinese Communist Party has been seeking to decouple from the United States, particularly as we got into this trade dispute.
When we talk about the term autonomous or semi-autonomous territories, could you give our listeners just a basic understanding of what that term means and how it's relevant given the fact that China is a communist nation? What are they permitted to do that the rest of China would not be permitted to do, and why is that important?
Well, they have their own legal system. They have their own governing system. They have their own judicial system. They are not subject to the law of China and the Chinese Communist Party. And so they have their own curriculum in their schools. They have their own history, literature, music, internet, you name it. They're essentially independent. What the Chinese Communist Party is basically saying is that Hong Kong is now a part of the mainland China, which means the full power of communism will descend down upon that and wash away all that was unique and independent and really free about Hong Kong.
Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping was set to push through a security law recently that would ban treason and anything that would be perceived as an offense against the state in Hong Kong, which I have to assume is going to be suppressing the rights of the citizens there to whatever degree of freedom of speech that they have, also freedom of expression, especially via social media as well, too, and also make the citizens of Hong Kong subject to the social credit laws that have been established in China. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, yes. Once you basically say that extradition and Chinese law applies, within China, the Chinese Communist Party is the law. So there's no rule of law, it's rule by law. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party can, without any kind of requirement for evidentiary requirements or any kind of due process, they can just detain you for no reason other than the Communist Party wants to, and then they can determine your fate and then essentially lock you up without due process. So what you're going from in Hong Kong is the ability to have a legal hearing to one where you're basically extradited to China where you have no rights.
Now, it's interesting that the four things that would subject an individual to prosecution there would be treason, secession, sedition, and subversion. So I guess in your estimation and in your experience, how far would that go? Treason, secession, sedition, and subversion.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they just say it. There's no threshold you have to meet. If the Communist Party determines that you are a threat, they can use any one of those and say, for this reason, you're being locked up. So there is no due process. There is no, justice is blind. It is literally rule by law, which means the Communist Party can do whatever. I think this is the thing that people need to understand about the Chinese Communist Party. Their system is really a system of subjugation. In other words, you don't have Chinese citizens. What you have is Chinese subjects. The Communist Party does with the population as they will. There's no rights that you have as a Chinese citizen per se. You're really more like a subject. Think in terms of America prior to the Revolutionary War. You could be jailed in whatever the king wanted to do. That's what could be done with you because you were subject. That's the same thing for the people of China.
Up until this point, I mean, we've pretty much enjoyed, I guess. I mean, I'm going to give you an armchair assessment on this here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we've pretty much enjoyed a cozy relationship up until President Trump with the Chinese. I mean, a lot of people would say, and I think rightfully so, that the Chinese have taken gross advantage of us. They've reverse engineered a number of our electronics and our software. They've engaged in espionage against us. They've stolen patents. I mean, a lot of the counterfeit materials that we see in the United States, it's manufactured there in China. So, but it seems as though, and not to turn this into a liberal or a conservative thing, but it certainly seems like our liberal friends across the aisle really like to think that China is our friend, and somehow that if we can just maintain a friendly relationship with China, that we can both coexist on this planet. And you and I have had the conversation before on this program that I think there are many of us who are a little bit more pragmatic that look at what China has done. And previously when you were on, we talked about the 6 different realms in which China was engaging in for all intents and purposes, warfare against the United States, certainly economically. And when we look at the development of the petro-yuan, the currency, the separate currency that was developed specifically to lure OPEC away from the U.S. dollar for the settlement of its international petroleum transactions, I mean, that's just one of it. Economically, they would like nothing more than to wipe us out. And again, our friends across the aisle there seem to think that China is just this big, cuddly panda bear. We just have to be nice to them and hug them and just, do our best to maintain relations with China, and everything is going to be fine. They're going to leave us alone.
Well, it's not just the Democratic Party. There's a lot in the Republican Party that think this way. Quite frankly, the last 8 administrations have had this infatuation with the Chinese Communist Party, thinking that if we just opened up, brought them into the globalized, internet-connected world, that they would become a democracy. And, of course, the Chinese Communist Party realized what was going on, studied the fall of the Soviet Union, and after Tiananmen massacre, essentially decided to turn all of these open-ended opportunities into vulnerabilities for us.
There are people who I have had conversations about China with who are quick to throw up, well, they're really not China. And I believe, trust me, I know this, but I want you to explain this, because people think, well, China is a state capitalist society, so it's really just a different version of the free market system that we have here. And I notice, you make it a point to say this, I make it a point to say this quite often, that it's the Chinese communists, or the communist Chinese. We have to specify that it is a communist regime. Can you explain exactly how the state capitalist system in China works and how it creates the illusion that there is a free market system when in fact there isn't one?
Yeah, it's not market reforms. What it is creating the system that allows for easy access to capital and credit for Chinese companies. And the way they do that is by having a closed financial system. So that closed financial system allows them to exchange dollars for renminbi for their companies. So once they sell goods into the United States, they earn dollars, and their companies go to the Bank of China and exchange according to an exchange rate set by the Bank of China. So it's not a market-based exchange rate, which means they have a closed financial system. You can't actually exchange RMB if you're a U.S. company. This allows them to essentially maintain this steady flow of imbalanced trade, and that's because when you have a consistent imbalance in trade, there's a corresponding trade in currencies that tends to raise prices so that trade levels out. So the reason we've had these 2 decades of unbalanced trade is because they've got a closed financial system, and they basically have a preferential exchange rate according to what the Chinese Communist Party wants. In addition, they use industrial policy. So they take U.S. talent, U.S. innovation, and U.S. technology using those dollars. So they basically pay off scientists in the United States to come to China. They buy companies at depressed prices, tech companies, and they use their People's Liberation Army to steal intellectual property. And then finally, they use trade policy, beneficial trade policy. They prevent competition within China and then subsidize their companies. And so using this monetary policy, industrial policy, and trade policy, they create these global champions that then are able to go out and dominate the global market. So it's an incredibly predatory and parasitic system that we've allowed to operate, for 2 decades in the international order.
Brigadier General Robert Spalding joins me on the Keith Hanson Show. He's a retired Air Force Brigadier General and a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, focusing on U.S.-China relations, economic and national security, and the Asia-Pacific military balance. He's also the author of the book Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. And, General, when I think about the title of your book, I think about this article that came out on oilprice.com, Is the U.S. Prepared for War with China? And what this article does is it lays out 6 strategic advances that China has been mobilizing using the preoccupation with coronavirus around the world to get these in motion. And there's a couple of them. Number 1, locking down control of the Hong Kong region. Number 2, rebuilding the People's Republic of China's position to resume domination of a global supply chain. And the origin manufacturing of those products, which is something that under President Trump, they've been losing that market share. They've been losing a lot of business as a result of President Trump being in office. They are rebuilding that position of advantage. Something that we've also heard very, very frequently here in the last 2 weeks, we've heard a lot about military domination of the South China Sea region and the Indo-Pacific. So the military domination of that region and then the breakup of a U.S. alliance in the Indo-Pacific and giving Russia a strategic place within that structure as well. There's a couple more, but I want to kind of touch on these individually, and these all play into this stealth war that China has been launching. We talked about the Hong Kong region. Let's look at the global supply chain manufacturing position. Not only does China manufacture products and goods for the United States, it also manufactures products for other countries around the world. What would it take to have China reestablish itself as the global producer of consumable goods? And how far off are they from achieving that goal?
Well, I mean, they already are the supply chain for the world. So I think what they've attempted to do is use the coronavirus and specifically their having come out of it before anybody else to solidify their position, to provide those, particularly those supplies needed for dealing with the coronavirus, PPE and masks and those things, and then to include medicines. They want to use that to strengthen their domination over the supply chain. I think the challenge that they face now is that for the first time in 2 decades or longer, the American people and people from all over the world are starting to begin to see what the Chinese Communist Party really is. And so it's much easier for them to deal with the world when they're doing the Deng Xiaoping hide and bide. It's much harder when they start to look like the Russians, which they do now.
All right, let's get into this South China Sea military domination issue here. I recall, and I'm trying to look this up as we're talking, and I can't find the article. I know I bookmarked it, but I don't have it. I'll pull it up here and definitely put it in the show notes. But it was a very bold statement that in the South China Sea region, the United States would most assuredly lose a war against China.
Well, I mean, I think what they've created is not only this excessive imbalance in ballistic missiles, because we were a member of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia, and China was not a member of that. So they built up thousands of conventional ballistic missiles in the 500 to 5,500 kilometer range. And at the same time, they've far surpassed now the size of our Navy. So their amount of forces in the region that they can bring to bear, outpaces what we have. And then you include in the South China Sea the 4 islands that they built that are built up now that have, surface-to-air missiles built on them. They have fighters deployed out there. And so it's really a bastion from which they can coerce the region. And we just don't have the firepower to match what they've built in their backyard.
And is this it? Okay. All right. Let me just get this over to my computer here. Okay, this is from the London Financial Times. This is dated Saturday, May 16th. Quote, headline, U.S. would lose any war fought in the Pacific with China. U.S. Would be defeated in a sea war with China when struggle to stop an invasion of Taiwan, according to a series of eye-opening war games by the Pentagon. American defense sources have told the Times the simulated conflicts conducted by the United States concluded that their forces would be overwhelmed. One war game focused on the year 2030, by which time the Chinese Navy would operate new attack submarines, aircraft carriers, and destroyers. It seems to me, at least, that China is biding its time, waiting for the most opportune moment to strike. And they would strike, of course, when we're at our weakest. And here's the issue. We have international economists that are projecting that it's likely our economy could collapse when we hit approximately $30 trillion in debt. Our debt becomes non-sustainable. It was on Fox News today that it's likely that another stimulus bill would be proposed and passed sometime in the next 3 months. It is conceivable that by the first or second year of Trump's second term, that we could be looking at standing on the doorstep of that $30 trillion number. Let me ask you this, and I know this is speculative, but what do you think the likelihood is that somebody who is middle-aged today could see an all-out military conflict or war with China in their lifetime?
I don't think it's likely, and that's because we still have, 450 ICBMs out in middle America. We've got nuclear submarines with sea-launched ballistic missiles, and we have an entire bomber force with nuclear weapons. I just don't think it's credible that we're going to go to war in that sense with China. The Chinese Communist Party could use their power to invade and overrun and dominate Taiwan. That's not something that's out of the realm of the possibility, but I don't think that's going to lead to war between the U.S. and China because of the devastating consequences of what that would look like.
So it would be an all-out war, just minus the bombs and bullets and guns and everything else. It would be an economic war. It would be a territorial war. They would assert themselves and they would flex their muscles, so that way they would control certain regions of the globe. They would certainly have the ability to introduce the Petro Yuan, get OPEC to stop settling their transactions in U.S. dollars, take that over, destroy our economy, and basically make us slaves from afar to the Chinese communists.
Well, I think that model works much better when we don't know what's going on because we allow them to be in our economy, to have our technology, innovation, talent, and capital. And instead, once we see what's going on and we get them out of our system, we get them out of our economy, we get them out of our labs, we get them out of our politics, out of our media, out of our internet. Once we get them out, it becomes much more difficult for them to sustain what is essentially a totalitarian regime. They can continue to grow because their system is parasitic on our open system. And so once you get them out of that ability to grow goes away.
It's funny you mentioned that we allow them to have access to our technology. Lest we forget, General, we allow them to drive around one of our ranking senators for over 20 years. Let's not forget about Dianne Feinstein's driver.
No,
we've granted them access to everything.
Infiltrating our society for since the end, really since the Tiananmen massacre, we've really looked the other way and believed that if we embraced them, that they would democratize. And of course, they laughed all the way to the bank.
Is it unrealistic to think that there are elected officials in Washington who, operating as globalists, would like nothing more than to sell the United States out to China if it enriches them personally?
Yeah, but I don't think they think of it that way. They think of it as, the natural order of things is China's going to be the dominant economy, and therefore we should just step aside and let that be. Since they don't understand the Chinese Communist Party, they don't understand what it is, they don't realize the ramifications to our republic is this slippery slope where we continue to lose our freedoms and lose our economic competitiveness. That's what happens when they become dominant.
Well, there's many people that operate as on the you just scratch the surface a little bit, and it becomes painfully obvious, crystal clear, that these individuals are truly globalists. That they would like to see a world with no borders, and that there would be a global, I don't know, some type of global governance in place. But the issue is that the closer that we get to actually having that become reality, the more likely it is that any governing body, let's assume for a moment that did happen, that China would have the military strength and the economic strength to take that governance over and, in essence, create a global Chinese empire.
Yeah, I mean that's what they don't understand is when you say you want globalism. We thought that it was going to end up being the promotion of free trade and democratic principles. And in reality, we have this system that promotes authoritarianism or totalitarianism in the case of the Chinese Communist Party.
Doesn't exactly give you warm fuzzies to think about it.
It's terrifying, and that's why I wrote the book and why I asked to leave the Air Force so that I could, spread the word.
Now, when you were in the Air Force, were you permitted at all to discuss this? Could you not discuss this, or what were your limitations?
My limitations were amounted to Chatham House rules, so I could give my opinion, but it had to remain within the confines of the venue that I was speaking. So what I felt I needed to do was really get out so that I could talk to and really get this message out beyond just kind of the inner sanctums of the interagency and the federal government.
In your estimation, if the Petro one, and I keep talking about this because this is something that really has, at least based upon my research and with people that I've spoken with, this has the potential of doing significant damage. We talk about the Cloward and Piven strategy and what putting massive numbers of people on welfare would do to our economy and how that could eventually facilitate the entire house of cards coming tumbling down. But I don't think that people really grasp how critical the fact that the American dollar is being used by OPEC to settle their international petroleum transactions, how important that really is. And I was curious if you would feel comfortable commenting on what your thoughts would be about how that would happen and ultimately what the consequences would be if OPEC came out and said, yep, you know what, we no longer have faith in the strength of the American economy because of their debt structure. They're insolvent. They have no money. Their currency is backed by nothing. It's a fiat currency. And we are going to put our faith and credit into the Chinese Petro yuan. What would the consequences be? How would we see that manifesting in our country and in our economy? What would happen to our stock markets, our bond markets, our real estate markets, our Forex markets, all of those things?
Well, I mean, this ability to continually raise the debt ceiling would go away, and our ability to just sell debt at extremely low prices, which is currently sustaining our economy, that would go away. That being said, I don't think that we're in danger of that anytime soon, because in order for the Chinese Communist Party to use RMB as a reserve currency, they would actually have to float that on some currency exchange in the global markets, and they are just not willing to do that. And the reason they're not willing to do that is because of the enormous debt load that they carry, the non-transparency and untrustworthiness of their institutions, and the fact that nobody believes any of the books for the companies that do business there. And so I think the challenge that they have as both as a government and as a currency is that they are not willing to subject themselves to trading on any kind of global exchange, and that in and of itself essentially prevents them from having a global currency that's worth anything. Nobody trusts China as a place for rule of law. Nobody trusts, therefore, the currency. And particularly because the PBOC is the one that sets what that currency is traded at. Right now, barring no change in that behavior by China, and I think if they say all of a sudden the PBOC said, okay, we're going to float the currency, I think you would have, because they have 300% debt to their GDP, I think they would rapidly see currency outflow and a collapse of their financial system, which is why they don't do it. As it stands, it gives them an advantage in trade because the PBOC sets the exchange rate, and this allows them to get to buy dollars on the cheap from their companies that earn that hard currency by selling products in the U.S.
General Spalding, that's just about all the time that we have. So, first of all, I want to thank you again for jumping on the program and sharing your insight. It's fascinating. I think there's a lot of what ifs with this, and I think there's a lot of confusion because, again, just like the coronavirus, people don't know who to listen to. They don't know where to get their information from. On one side of the fence, they're hearing that, well, China's our friend, and they're not really that bad. They're just misunderstood. And then they go to another source, and they're being told that China is the closest thing that we have to evil incarnate. And so I think there is a lot of confusion, and your perspective on this, and I would encourage people to check out, and I'll put a link in the show notes to the previous conversation that you and I had, where we discussed the outlines of your book, Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept, because you really hit on all of the different ways that China has been launching this stealth war. And when you scratch the surface and begin to familiarize yourself with all the techniques and the tactics that China has been using over the past several decades, it becomes very, very clear that there is an agenda, and that agenda is not good. And I appreciate your perspective on this because, again, you give a perspective that I think for many people is refreshing. So I appreciate your time. I, for one, appreciate your time, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
All right. God bless. Keep up the good work, and we will talk soon.